She wasn't rich, she wasn't educated in finance, and in 1983 she was almost out of money. With only $20 and leftover grocery scraps, she had two choices: panic or think differently. What she chose changed everything. Instead of seeing scraps as waste, she saw them as untapped value. Day by day, she built a small system that slowly reduced her dependence on money itself. And over time, that system created breathing room, then stability, then growth. This isn't just an old story, it's a blueprint, and once you understand it, you'll never look at waste the same way again. The day everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning in the fall of 1983. Margaret pulled open her refrigerator door and stood there for a long moment. Not because she was deciding what to eat. She already knew. There wasn't much to decide. A half-used onion wrapped in a paper towel, some leftover rice in a bowl with a cracked lid, a few limp celery stalks that had seen better days, and on the counter behind her, a small envelope with $20 in it. That was it. That was her week. Outside, the entire country felt like it was holding its breath. Unemployment had climbed to nearly 11%, the highest it had been since the Great Depression. Factories were shutting down, neighbors were quietly packing up and moving. The news every night felt like a slow drip of bad news that never quite stopped. Interest rates were brutal, grocery prices had climbed steadily for years, and for millions of ordinary Americans, the idea of financial breathing room felt like something from a different life. Margaret wasn't a banker. She wasn't an economist. She was a 34-year-old woman in a small rented house in the Midwest, trying to keep things together for herself and her two kids. Her husband had been laid off 6 months earlier. The part-time work she'd picked up barely covered the basics. Every dollar had weight to it. Every purchase required a mental calculation she never asked to be good at. But here's the thing about pressure. Real pressure. The kind that doesn't let you look away. Sometimes it doesn't break you. Sometimes it forces you to see things you never noticed before. That Tuesday morning, standing in front of that refrigerator, Margaret didn't know she was about to figure something out. Something small. Something that over the next 2 years would quietly change everything about how she lived and how she thought about money. She closed the refrigerator door, looked at that $20, and made a decision most people would have missed entirely. If this kind of story, real people, real solutions, real results, is what you're here for, make sure you're subscribed, because this one goes deeper than you might expect. The decision most people would have ignored. She didn't go to the store. That was the decision. Most people in her position would have grabbed that $20, driven to the nearest grocery store, and bought whatever stretched the farthest. Bread, maybe, canned beans, something cheap and filling. And that would have made complete sense. Nobody would have blamed her. But Margaret stood at that counter and did something different first. She looked, really looked, not at what was missing, but at what was actually there. The half onion, the rice, the celery, a heel of bread that had gone slightly stiff, some dried beans she'd pushed to the back of the cabinet months ago and forgotten about, a nearly empty bottle of vegetable oil, 3 potatoes that were starting to sprout at the tips, and a small block of cheese, hard around the edges, that she'd almost thrown out the day before. To most people, that's a sad collection of leftovers, almost nothing, scraps. To Margaret that morning, it became a question, a real one. She asked herself, how many meals is this actually? Not how many meals does it look like? How many meals could it be if she was careful and creative? She grabbed a notepad, an old one with maybe 30 pages left, and she started writing things down. Not a grocery list, an inventory. Everything she had, every item, every partial item, even the things that seemed too small to count. That single habit, Writing it down instead of guessing was the first crack in how she'd always thought about resources. Because when you see it on paper, something shifts. That random collection of items stops looking like not enough and starts looking like a starting point. She counted 11 possible meal combinations from what was already in that kitchen. 11, without spending a single dollar. Now here's where it gets interesting, because writing that list wasn't just about food. It made her wonder, what else had she been overlooking? The things she almost threw away. That notepad didn't stay in the kitchen for long. After she finished her food inventory, Margaret walked slowly through the rest of the house. Not with any grand plan, just with that same quiet question still running in the back of her mind. What else is already here that I've been ignoring? It didn't take long before she started finding things. In the bathroom cabinet, there was a bar of soap that had shrunk down to a thin sliver. She'd been 2 days away from tossing it. Instead, she pressed it firmly against the new bar she had, a trick her grandmother had mentioned once, years ago, that she'd never actually tried. The two pieces bonded together overnight. One bar became whole again. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but that tiny moment stuck with her, because she realized the sliver wasn't garbage. It was just something she hadn't decided to value yet. She found candles burned down to their last inch, old newspapers stacked by the back door she'd meant to recycle, a ball of rubber bands around a drawer handle, glass jars from pasta sauce and pickles she'd been casually throwing in the trash for months, a worn towel she'd replaced with a newer one but never actually discarded, twist ties, buttons, a spool of thread, half a bottle of dish soap. None of it was exciting, none of it was dramatic, but when she added it all to her notepad, right below the food inventory, something started to become visible that hadn't been visible before. She wasn't surrounded by scarcity, she was surrounded by things she'd been trained to see as finished, used up, done. That distinction sounds small. It isn't. There's a word researchers who study consumption habits use for this pattern. They call it endpoint blindness, the tendency to see an item's usefulness as ending the moment it stops being convenient. Margaret had never heard that term, but she was dismantling the idea in real time, room by room, with a cheap notepad and a quiet Tuesday morning. She sat back down at the kitchen table and looked at her list. It had grown to 2 full pages. And then she flipped to a clean page and wrote 3 words at the top that would become the foundation of everything she built over the next 2 years. What do those 3 words say? That's exactly where we're going next. The 3 words that built the system. She wrote, "Use it fully." 3 words. No complicated philosophy behind them, no financial theory, just a simple personal rule she decided, right there at that kitchen table, to take seriously for the first time in her life. Use it fully. Not use it, not use most of it. Use it fully. Every last bit of value inside it before it leaves your hands. It sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but think about how rarely most people actually do it. The toothpaste tube gets tossed when it gets hard to squeeze, not when it's actually empty. The loaf of bread gets thrown out when the last 2 heels are left because nobody likes the heels. The half-used bottle of shampoo gets pushed aside when a new one arrives. The vegetable scraps go straight into the trash the moment dinner's finished. Margaret had been doing all of it. Every single one, and she hadn't thought twice about any of it, because that's just what people did. That's what felt normal. But normal, she was realizing, had been quietly costing her money every single week without ever announcing itself. So she started small. That same afternoon, she took the vegetable scraps from lunch, onion skin, celery ends, the woody tops of the potatoes, and dropped them into a pot with water. She let it simmer for an hour on low heat. What came out wasn't fancy, it wasn't restaurant quality, but it was a genuine usable vegetable broth that she poured into a clean glass jar and set in the refrigerator. something she would have paid for at the store, made entirely from things she would have thrown in the trash 2 days earlier. That jar sat on the second shelf of her refrigerator, and she looked at it every time she opened the door. It became a symbol for her, not of poverty or struggle, but of paying attention. She started applying the same thinking everywhere the rule could reach. Bread heels got cubed and toasted into croutons or breadcrumbs. Overripe bananas, the ones with the black spots that looked finished, got mashed and mixed into a simple batter for banana bread that her kids actually asked for by name. Hard cheese edges got grated over meals instead of discarded. Citrus peels got dried and used to freshen small spaces in the house naturally. Each of these things took maybe 5 to 10 extra minutes. That was it. But here's what Margaret noticed after about 3 weeks of living by those 3 words. The $20 she'd started with that Tuesday morning had stretched across the entire week with a few dollars still remaining. Not because she'd found some secret, not because prices had dropped, but because she had stopped hemorrhaging small amounts of value every single day without noticing. She started calling those daily losses something, a name that made them real to her, and once she named them, everything changed about how she saw her budget. Naming the silent drains. She called them silent drains. Not big expenses, not obvious mistakes. The small, invisible, completely normal-feeling losses that happened every single day without ever triggering any alarm. The ones that didn't feel like decisions because they'd become so automatic they barely registered as choices at all. And once she had a name for them, she couldn't stop seeing them everywhere. The light left on in a room nobody was sitting in, the faucet running while she scrubbed a dish, the extra portion cooked out of habit that sat in the pot, got reheated once, and then quietly got thrown away 4 days later when nobody touched it again. The generic brand sitting right next to the name brand on the shelf, 30 cents cheaper, that she'd always reached past without really thinking about why. None of these things felt significant in isolation. That's exactly what made them dangerous. Margaret started keeping a second list in her notepad, not an inventory this time, a drain log. Every time she caught herself about to waste something, spend something automatically, or toss something that still had use left in it, she wrote it down. Not to punish herself, not to create guilt, just to make the invisible visible. Within 2 weeks, that list covered 4 full pages. She sat with those 4 pages one evening after her kids were in bed and did some rough mental math. Conservative estimates, rounding down on everything. And even with all of that caution, the number that emerged was uncomfortable. She estimated that her silent drains had been costing her somewhere between $40 and $60 every single month. In a household running on almost nothing, that wasn't a rounding error. That was a grocery budget. That was a utility bill. That was real money disappearing through pure habit and inattention. Here's what's important to understand about that moment. Margaret didn't feel defeated by that number. She'd half expected something like it. What she felt instead was something much more useful. She felt like she'd found a lever. Because a silent drain isn't bad luck. It isn't an economic policy you can't control. It isn't your employer or the price of gas or the interest rate on a loan. A silent drain is a habit. And habits, unlike most of the things that were making her life difficult in 1983, could actually be changed without anyone's permission. That realization sat differently than anything else she'd experienced in those 6 difficult months. For the first time, there was something in her financial life that responded directly to her attention, something that got better the moment she decided to look at it honestly. She circled the 4 pages in her notepad and wrote one question in the margin that she'd come back to again and again over the following months. Comment "drain" if you've ever looked back at a month and wondered where all the money actually went, because what she wrote in that margin is something most people never think to ask themselves. The question that built the foundation. She wrote, "What would I do if this was the last one?" Not dramatic, not poetic, just a practical question she decided to ask herself every single time she was about to use something, spend something, or throw something away. What would I do with this if I knew I couldn't replace it easily? It sounds like a scarcity mindset, but it wasn't, not really. Scarcity thinking makes you anxious. It makes you hoard and worry and freeze. What Margaret was building was something different. It was closer to intentionality. The difference between those two things is enormous, and it lives entirely in how the question makes you feel when you ask it. Anxiety or awareness, panic or pause. For her, it became a pause, just a half-second beat before a decision, long enough to ask the question, long enough to actually answer it honestly. And that pause started producing results she could see and feel. She applied it to her cleaning supplies first. A bottle of all-purpose cleaner that usually lasted her 3 weeks suddenly stretched to nearly 2 months, not because she cleaned less, because she measured instead of poured, a quick spray instead of a generous glug. She realized she'd been using roughly 3 times more than any surface actually needed, purely out of habit and the unconscious feeling that more meant better. She applied the same pause to her laundry, full machine loads instead of half loads, cold water instead of hot for everyday clothes, something she'd always assumed made a meaningful difference in cleanliness, but tested carefully and found made almost none. Line drying when weather allowed, instead of defaulting straight to the dryer. Small decisions, barely noticeable individually, but they showed up clearly in her utility bill the following month. Then she took the pause into her weekly shopping, and this is where the system really started to take its full shape. Margaret began shopping with her inventory list in hand, not a traditional grocery list built from memory and habit, a list built from what she actually had, what was close to running out, and what meals she could realistically build around both. She stopped shopping by category, produce, dairy, meat, pantry, and started shopping by gap, only filling what was genuinely empty, only buying what had a specific, planned purpose in the next 7 days. The difference in her cart was immediate, and the difference at the register was something she hadn't fully anticipated. Her first intentional shopping trip using this method cost her $11.40 for a full week of meals. She stood at the register and checked the receipt twice because she didn't quite believe it. She folded that receipt carefully and tucked it into the back of her notepad, right next to the 4 pages of silent drains, right next to the question she'd written in the margin. She was building something now. She could feel it. Not just a collection of tricks, a real, repeatable system with its own internal logic. And like any system worth keeping, it was starting to generate something beyond just savings. It was starting to generate confidence. And that, as she would discover in the weeks ahead, turned out to be the most valuable resource of all. Comment system if you've ever realized that a small change in your routine quietly saved you more than you expected, because what happened next is where everything she'd built started compounding in ways she never predicted. When small wins start compounding. The first time Margaret had money left over at the end of the month, she didn't spend it. That might sound obvious, but understand what that moment actually meant for her. For nearly 7 months, every dollar that came in had a destination before it even arrived. Rent, utilities, food, the small, grinding list of things that kept the household functional. There had been no such thing as leftover. There had only been enough and not enough. So when she looked at her small jar on the kitchen counter, the one she'd started dropping unspent dollars into at the end of each week, and counted $23 sitting inside it, something happened that had nothing to do with math. She felt stable, for the first time in months. Not wealthy, not comfortable in any conventional sense, but stable, like the ground under her feet had quietly stopped shifting. That feeling did something important to her psychology. It changed her relationship with money from something reactive, something she was always responding to, always chasing, always slightly behind, into something she was beginning to actually direct. Researchers who study financial behavior talk about this shift using the term internal locus of control, the feeling that your actions have a real, traceable connection to your outcomes, that what you do today genuinely affects what tomorrow looks like. For people living in financial stress, that feeling is often the first casualty. Everything starts to feel random, unpredictable, like the rules don't apply or don't work. Margaret was getting that feeling back, dollar by dollar, decision by decision. And here's where the compounding started. Because confidence, real earned confidence, changes how you move through your day. She started noticing opportunities she would have walked past 6 months earlier. A neighbor 2 streets over had a garden that produced far more zucchini and tomatoes every August than one family could use. Margaret had known this for 2 years, had never thought to knock on that door. She knocked. The neighbor was genuinely happy to share. Fresh vegetables, free for the rest of the summer, in exchange for nothing more than a friendly conversation and occasionally helping to pick. She found that the local bakery 3 blocks away sold day-old bread at half price every morning after 9. Not stale, not bad, just yesterday's loaves that couldn't be sold as fresh. She'd driven past that bakery hundreds of times, never stopped. Now she stopped twice a week. The library, which she'd used for her kids' books but never thought of as a personal resource, turned out to carry magazines, guides, and practical books on home repair, gardening, and food preservation. Free, available anytime. She checked out a book on basic home canning and spent one Saturday afternoon learning how to preserve tomatoes properly. That skill alone saved her a noticeable amount over the following winter. None of these things required money. They required attention and awareness and the quiet willingness to ask a question or walk through a door she'd previously walked past without a second thought. Comment compound if you've ever discovered a free or low-cost resource that had been right in front of you the whole time, because what started happening to Margaret's numbers over the next 3 months is something that will genuinely surprise you. The numbers and the moment she knew. 3 months after that first Tuesday morning with the $20 and the near-empty refrigerator, Margaret sat down at her kitchen table with her notepad and did a full accounting. Not a guess, not a rough feeling, a real line-by-line look at where things actually stood. She had done this before, back in the dark early months when tracking felt more like watching a wound than managing a budget. But this time felt different before she even picked up her pencil. This time she wasn't bracing herself, she was genuinely curious. What she found across those pages surprised even her. Her monthly food expenses had dropped by nearly 40% compared to where they'd been before she started her system. Not through deprivation, not through skipping meals or feeding her kids less, through inventory, intentionality, and the steady elimination of silent drains, the scrap broth, the day-old bread, the neighbor's garden, the planned shopping trips built around gaps instead of habits, all of it together, quietly doing its work every single week. Her household supply costs, cleaning products, soap, paper goods, had been cut almost in half, partly through her use-it-fully rule, partly through simple substitutions she'd researched at the library. White vinegar and water in a spray bottle replaced 2 different commercial cleaners. Baking soda handled things she'd previously bought specialty products for. These weren't sacrifices. The results were the same. The cost was a fraction. Her utility bills had come down as well. Not dramatically, but consistently. Enough to matter in a budget this tight. Every load of laundry in cold water, every light switched off, every full dishpan instead of running water continuously. Small habits, repeated daily, showing up as real numbers at the end of the month. She added it all up carefully. Then she added it up again to make sure. Over those 3 months, her system had effectively created an additional $180 in her household budget. Not through earning more, though her part-time hours had increased slightly, but through stopping the losses, through reclaiming the money that had been silently disappearing for years before she ever thought to look for it. $180. In a household that had been surviving on almost nothing, that number represented something extraordinary. It was 3 months of utility bills. It was a small emergency cushion that hadn't existed before. It was breathing room, actual, real breathing room. But the number wasn't the moment that got to her most. The moment came on a Saturday afternoon in late November. Her youngest had torn a hole in his only good pair of school trousers. A few months earlier, that would have sent a spike of anxiety straight through her chest, a problem with no clean solution, a choice between fixing it and something else that also needed paying for. Instead, she went to her sewing kit, the one she'd inventoried back on that first Tuesday, threaded a needle in under a minute, and repaired the trousers so cleanly that her son looked at them the next morning and asked if she'd bought new ones. She hadn't bought anything. She stood in that small laundry room and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not pride exactly, something quieter than that. Something closer to the feeling of recognizing yourself again, of being someone who solves problems instead of someone who is buried by them. Comment shift if you've ever had a small moment, not a big dramatic one, that showed you how much you'd actually changed. The blueprint that still works today. Margaret's story ended quietly, the way real transformations usually do. By the spring of 1984, her husband had found steady work again. The worst of the economic pressure had gradually lifted. Life didn't become easy overnight, it rarely does, but the grinding daily anxiety that had defined those months slowly released its grip. They moved into a slightly larger house the following year. The kids grew up. Life moved forward the way life does. But here's what Margaret said years later when she looked back on that period. She said she was almost grateful for the $20 Tuesday, not for the hardship, but for what the hardship forced her to see. Because the system she built during those months, out of necessity, out of pressure, out of nothing more than a cheap notepad and a willingness to pay attention, never left her. She kept the habits long after she needed them for survival, not out of fear, out of genuine respect for what they'd given her. Control, clarity, the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly where their resources are going. And here's the part that matters most for you sitting here in 2024. The economic pressures are different now. The specific numbers are different. The context has shifted. But the core problem Margaret was solving in 1983 is identical to what millions of people are navigating right now. Money leaving faster than expected. Costs rising in ways that feel outside your control. The persistent feeling that no matter how much comes in, there never seems to be quite enough left over. Her system wasn't built for 1983. It was built for human nature. And human nature hasn't changed at all. So here is the blueprint. Practical, specific, usable, starting today. The first step is the inventory. Before you spend a single dollar this week, walk through your kitchen, your bathroom, your storage spaces, and write down what you actually have, not what you think you have, what is physically there. Most people discover they have significantly more than they realized, and significantly more than they need to buy this week. That list alone will change your next shopping trip. The second step is your own drain log. For the next 7 days, every time you throw something away, replace something that still had use left, or spend money on pure automatic habit, write it down. No judgment, just documentation. By day 7, you will have a clear picture of where your silent drains actually live, and you will be genuinely surprised by the number you come up with when you add them honestly. The third step is the pause, Margaret's half-second beat before every decision. What would I do with this if it was harder to replace? You don't need to answer yes or no to anything. You just need to actually ask the question before the automatic behavior takes over. That pause, practiced consistently, rewires the habit loop over time in a way that feels effortless within a few weeks. The fourth step is substitution without sacrifice. Spend 1 hour this week, just one, looking at your 3 highest recurring household expenses and asking whether a simpler, cheaper alternative exists that produces the same result. Not a worse result, the same result. You will almost always find one, sometimes 2. Margaret found them in cleaning supplies, in bread, in vegetables, in soap. Your version will look different, but it exists. The fifth step is the jar. Physical or digital, it doesn't matter. Whatever you don't spend this week because of your inventory, your drain log, your pause, and your substitutions, put it somewhere visible and separate. Let it accumulate. Watch it grow. That visibility is not a small thing. It is the feedback loop that keeps the system alive. Margaret's $23 in that kitchen jar wasn't just money, it was evidence, proof that what she was doing was real and working and worth continuing. These 5 steps aren't revolutionary, they aren't complicated, they won't make you rich overnight, and that was never the point. The point is what Margaret actually discovered on that quiet Tuesday morning in 1983. That financial control doesn't begin with how much money you make. It begins with how clearly you can see what you already have and how deliberately you choose to use it. Small, consistent, repeatable. That's the whole system. Comment blueprint if you're going to try even one of these steps this week. And if you know someone right now who is in that exact feeling Margaret had, standing in front of a near-empty refrigerator wondering how to make it work, share this with them. Not because it promises miracles, but because sometimes the most powerful thing you can give someone who feels like they have nothing is the clear, honest reminder that they are looking at their situation wrong. They don't have nothing. They just haven't learned to see what they have yet. That's what Margaret figured out, and it changed everything.